Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second edition of the 2021 Healthcare Innovation Virtual Digital Health Series. I'm your host, Stephen McCollum, and I thank all of you for joining us today. And I would also like to thank all of the sponsors for our program. You can learn more about the sponsors who are participating in today's program by visiting the website where there's information about all of them. And specifically, I would like to thank Ambra Healthcare and Nuance for hosting or sponsoring our first session, which is all about AI. Couple of quick housekeeping announcements. You can put your Q&As for the speakers in the Q&A box, and we'll get to those during the question portion of the program. Also, don't forget to check out the chat box. I'm going to be putting some questions in there in just a minute to get the conversation going in the chat box so we can have that going alongside the session. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and introduce everyone. First up, we've got the Chief Data Scientist from the University of Pennsylvania Health System, Mike Druglas. Welcome, Mike. Thank you for joining us. Joining Mike, we have Ken Harper, who is the Vice President and General Manager of the Dragon Ambient Experience at Nuance. Welcome, Ken. We also have Morris Panner, the Chief Executive Officer of Ambra Health. Welcome, Morris. And of course, Garrett Vagantis, who's the Managing Director of OSF Innovation. And last but not least, Mark Zamansky, who is the Senior Vice President and Chief Data Officer at Children's Health. Joining our esteemed panelists today is our Managing Editor, Rajiv Leventhal, who's going to be the moderator of the conversation. And with that, Rajiv, I will turn it over to you, and I will see everyone for the Q&A portion of the program.
Great, thanks, Stephen. Really excited to be here with this great, diverse group of industry stakeholders. We have a mix of chief data scientists, chief data officers, providers, innovation leaders, technology solution executives. And I think, you know, one way to start as we kind of get into our discussion is to hear from everybody just briefly, 30 to 60 seconds about you, yourself, your organization, and how artificial intelligence impacts your role, your life, and your organization. And then we can drill down, of course, into some of the specific issues and themes of today. Morris, why don't we start with you at Ambra? What you can tell us a little bit about yourself, your organization, and the impact that AI is having on all of that today.
Thank you, Rajiv. What we do is really make a data type for care and precision medicine more accessible. And why this became so relevant is partly because of the power of AI and machine learning. Because all of a sudden, the ability to extract more data from pixels, which are images, and then take that and match that with other healthcare information can transform the way people receive care and the way researchers develop new therapies. So all of a sudden, what used to be something that maybe your radiologist looked at to determine yay or nay has now become a living data type inside of a really, really important development where machines are augmenting, literally machine vision, people's ability to see and understand.
Great. How about Mark? How about you at Children's?
What we're trying to do with artificial intelligence is leverage our electronic health record to an extent that we've never done before. And in order to do that, we're breaking down the barriers of the classic discrete field. So using natural language processing and machine learning, we're actually going into the physician's or the clinician's notes and pulling out information there into data models that allow us to look at trends, outcomes, and really encompass way more data than the traditional clinician would ever be able to get to. And then building upon those, trying to support care coordination and a little bit of predictive information as we look at patients and who returns to us frequently.
Great. Michael, how about you? Give us a little overview of what's going on at Penn.
Yeah, great. Well, a lot of it's kind of informed on where I come from. I spent about 15 years in missile defense, detecting missiles to shoot down. And when I came over to Penn as a chief data scientist, I asked what they wanted us to detect. And they said, well, let's start with sepsis. And so we did that. and learned that that wasn't enough to actually help patients. And we changed, my department name from data science department to predictive healthcare, and really started to focus on the workflows and how to optimize those with the right insight at the right time, connected to evidence-based interventions, and then instrument ourselves to actually see those outcomes. And so in the 7 years that we've been here in this organization, we really focus on those kind of programs.
Great. Garrett, how about you at OSF, a little synopsis?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. So I will be somewhat representing more of the clinician overview. I'm a physician by training, and now I am currently part of the very small investment team, OSF Ventures, which is within OSF Innovations. And our remit is actually to look outside of our organization, whereas the previous panelists were talking about data sets that they likely already have. As OSF Ventures, we're looking at what companies can bring solutions to OSF that address unmet needs, whether it's unmet medical needs or unmet workflow needs. And so we invest in those companies, partner with those companies, bring those companies into our system, help them take hold, and then evangelize those companies and tell our colleagues outside of our system what's working well, and hope that they get an opportunity to evaluate those solutions.
Great. And last but certainly not least, Ken, what's going on with you guys over at Nuance related to AI?
Yeah, hey everyone. So our mission is very much looking at conversational AI to automate the process of documentation for clinicians. So it's all about, for us, voice and the power of language, and how can AI take what is being spoken between a physician and a patient, contextualize that, and figure out how can we take that rich conversation and convert that into a well summarized clinical note, really no different than a clinician having typed it or dictated it after the encounter is over. So conversational AI is really at the core of what we focus on to reduce the documentation burden that we know is a big challenge in healthcare today.
Great. Well, great to have that background context from all of you. And I think one of the things that's going to make today's discussion particularly compelling is that you're all coming from, different areas of the healthcare ecosystem, and you'll be able to bring fresh and unique perspectives. And because, of course, artificial intelligence is such a broad area, we're going to discuss several different parts of that, several different elements. AI, is it living up to the promise? Has it been overhyped? Where is the real potential to transform hospital, medical group, and health system operations? What are the biggest challenges? And of course, where are the most promising breakthroughs and use cases happening today, and where will they be happening in the near future? I wanted to start by hearing from all of you really at this on this panel about this question. For AI in healthcare to truly reach its potential, it will require health systems to understand that they are the center for innovation. They are the ones that are piloting these programs and are developing these projects. So a big focus there is trying to build the culture of engineering rigor and accountability to these systems. That is, it might feel like a big loaded question, but clearly there is a strategy here. There is an approach to building this type of an infrastructure. Mike, I wanted to start with you. What's been Penn's learnings here in terms of being able to build this infrastructure where you can kind of build everything out of from there and have everything stem from that?
That's a great question there. Good introduction to I think one of the big challenges that we have in changing healthcare. I mean, I'll start with saying that I think vendors, external systems can provide meaningful impact in delivering care. If you think about AI in radiology, identifying tumors more effectively, kind of talking about natural language understanding and natural language processing. Those are like kind of very focused, provide a smarter blinky light into the workflow that can be really impactful. But I think for sustained improvement, where all of a sudden we start to see a step function in care for patients, expanding access to care. It's really going to come from the health systems themselves as they realize like they're the innovation centers, they're the technology centers on par with delivering healthcare. And I think, for us at Penn, we've seen what generally other industries have seen, where we really need to build a culture of a decision maker, someone who has a stake in the business, owns the resources to change that business, and then understands how to define a problem in the data. Have evidence that there is a problem, have evidence that there's an intervention, and figure out how to reimagine the workflow to take advantage of these new insights, and then design a solution and test it. And you're not done there. Once you test it and it works, how do you deploy it and sustain it in operations and continue to improve it, make sure it's resilient? That's kind of a mouthful. Each kind of, I was thinking about this question, and those are really the significant bullets that we try to adhere to in our principles and our team. And around that, in healthcare, that's really centers around confident clinical informaticists, leaders that are, in charge of, reducing some key performance indicators in a particular service line or department, and own the resources, people, and technology to make that happen. In other industries, those would be like the product managers or product line owner. And then, from that, a lot of things start to kind of naturally coalesce. One thing that's really important is cross-disciplinary team that doesn't disperse at the end of that product. So, for us, it's we have data scientists, clinical informaticists, human factors designers, software engineers, analysts that are focused on the EHR that we have, and project manager. And so those are teams that once something's deployed, they don't disperse. They're still a part of that product that we deployed, and accountable for its success or failure. And I think those are just the mechanisms that kind of define like a modern or a technology company that's delivering products. I think that's the same kind of organization that health systems have to have.
Great. Anyone else want to take a stab at that? I think that provided a great overview of really the elements that are necessary and what it takes to kind of build that infrastructure. Anybody else have any thoughts on some other approaches or what has worked or not worked in your organization?
I could jump in. I don't know how many people attending today are on the vendor side, but one of the things that I think is true about AI right now is a lot of money and a lot of company formation is happening. And there's a lot of question of whether these companies are going to be able to create business models that work. And what Mike is talking about, in a way, we have to kind of turn on its ear when we're outside the system and figure out what our insertion point is, where we can add value in that chain that he laid out. And if we can't do that, then it is sort of a science project and we run out of capital before we get to the end of the road. So one of the things that I think is important about this session is there's got to be that fluidity between people, like OSF Innovations is a great example. That's an example where you have a clinician, and I'm sure Penn does this too. You're trying to bring in companies to figure out where the insertion point is, and not because you want to give them money, but because the whole thing's not going to work until you have some way of making the ecosystem sustainable. So I actually think this panel is a great example of kind of what has to happen writ large.
It's a great point, Morris. I wanted to add to that. Absolutely agree. I think, AI is the topic here today, but everything I laid out is really just about informatics. It doesn't have to have a artificial intelligence kernel, right? You can have kind of a heuristic algorithm that's providing some kind of information. But I think in terms of AI, the thing that's kind of unique here, when vendors come in for a solution or you have an internal data science team, that model will degrade. It will lose its performance through drift. In its outcome or the model that it has. The intervention will drift. And how do you know what's not working? So it's a really intricate connection point between the technology and intervention. And that's why you need, as Morris was saying, you need that careful connection between that piece of technology, which is a small box in the big box of system solutions, that's really well understood by, I would say, the decision maker or the business owner on the health system side.
And as we look at, as we kind of dive into some of the decision-making criteria that goes into partnering with the right organizations and people making the right strategic investments. Garrett, this is your wheelhouse, right? At OSF Innovation. What are the strategies, the best practices to ensure that you're investing wisely in the right AI projects and solutions? And of course, I'm sure there have been mistakes and failures, but what can you kind of take us through that process and how it works?
Sure, Rajiv, happy to give some high-level thoughts on that. First of all, we are always taking the pulse of different business units within our health system just to find out where they are experiencing problems or where they think they get additional lift through technology. So we keep a close tab with our colleagues in those business units. And then again, as I mentioned, our remit is to go outside and track down the best and the brightest and bring those back to our business units to give them an opportunity to evaluate. And we do that oftentimes through pilot studies. But even before we get to those pilot studies, the criteria that we look at as in this case, venture investors are around the people, product, and price. Those are the three main criteria. On the people side, are the entrepreneurs credible? And are they committed? Are they really focused on developing their solution and continuing to refine it? On the product side, how validated is it? How many studies have been conducted, and proper studies, where oftentimes you have a strong control group that really gets to answering some of those questions on drift, for example, that will inevitably come up when the product is applied in the real world setting. And then lastly, price. And that gets to our ROI question, which I'm sure will come up. Some of the Q&A questions already were around that topic, but what's the cost to implement? And on the and post implementation, are you able to demonstrate cost reduction or revenue generation? Those are the core questions around economic value that we try to address before even getting the product into our system. And last and most importantly, as Michael pointed out, you need to have a business unit owner that once the technology gets adopted, that owner has accountability and responsibility to ensure that attention is paid to that project and that technology to maximize the ROI that can come of it. So that's the framework that we use. And I'll just give two very brief examples of companies that we're working with. On one hand, we spoke about computer and vision and machine learning being used to apply or glean insights from pixels. And in one case, we're looking not at radiological data, but actually at blood loss. So a company that we're working with called Gauss Surgical is taking photos real time in the operating room to help clinicians understand how much blood is being lost in the patient during the procedure on a real-time basis, and afterwards too, quantifying through taking pictures of sponges and canisters. So that helps clinicians who, it's been shown, have a harder time over a half a liter of blood loss getting the real precise number and guiding care, blood transfusion questions and the like afterwards. So that's one example. Another example is a company that's developing a point of care sepsis diagnostic called Inflamatics, and they have used artificial intelligence, machine learning in their development of their products. They are querying host immune response to a pathogen and looking at mRNA profiles within the host itself, and using statistical analysis to get to two main questions: is it viral or is it bacterial? Number one. And number two, how severe is the inflammatory response of that patient? And from there, guiding clinicians on a care pathway. So those are two very different examples of how artificial intelligence, machine learning has been leveraged, in these, more or less point of care solutions and then taking those back into our organization, helping those companies develop those products, and then eventually deploy and gain the full value of that application. So I hope that answered that question, Rajiv.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's great to hear those examples as well. I want to flip the question to Morris and Ken, coming from the technology solution company side. What are, on the other side of the table, what are some of the factors, the really key core factors that go into making sure that you're partnering with the right provider, with the right end user customers, and what are some of the things that each side looks for in those discussions and those conversations?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in first. Yeah. I mean, I think from a supplier perspective, I mean, ultimately, there has to be a very clear ROI for the organization, in deploying these types of solutions. I mean, it seems like an obvious statement, but I can't tell you how many times you see some of these things being developed, in the AI space, and there isn't a clear business model in terms of exactly what problem is it going to solve, and how is that actually helping the healthcare organization economically, in terms of how their business is being run, how the operation is being run. So, I think just these AI solutions, they need to be focused, they need to be narrow, there need to be very specific problems that are being solved, but ultimately, that has to have a clear return for the organization, whether that's, increasing revenue in some way through patient throughput, or the way that's driving rev cycle improvement, or just reducing costs. That there has to be a very clear ROI, for these solutions to really be sustainable.
Just wanted to add to that real quick. I think as vendors come in and look to provide solutions, if you can convince the CFO that this is a good thing, then you're probably on a good path. I found that there's a lot of excitement on the clinical side for something that looks interesting and possible. But if you have that hard evidence to get the excitement of the CFO, you probably have a pretty good business plan.
And I'd like to build on what Mike and Ken were saying, and to a certain extent what Garrett was saying. We have spent a lot of time what we call the ICP. So when you're a technology vendor, you try to come up with your ideal customer profile. Who is the person inside the organization that you're actually trying to sell to? And we struggled with that because we found it very difficult to find an org chart. It's changing a little bit, but it's very hard to find the innovator inside of any given department. So we've really tried to map, and maybe this is somewhat of what Mike is saying. We have tried to find, and what Garrett's saying, we're trying to find the business owner who is a trailblazer, who is brave, who is intellectually curious. And I used to say kind of crazy, but then people decided that was pejorative. But you have to have risk takers inside of an organization. And that's kind of what innovators are. So I've tried to tone it down. But I used to, with some of them, I say, you're just a nutty guy. And they're like, absolutely, I have to fix healthcare. I'm completely committed to it. I'll do anything. And I'm like, you're our person. And they have very different titles and they have very different concerns. But the way you get to them is you say, healthcare isn't working, and everyone nods and says, in some way or another, I'm dissatisfied. I have had an experience where it has touched my heart, and I have not been able to deliver what I have wanted to do, and that's why I'm in the business. And ROI matters a lot. But at the very beginning, that emotional connection of you're on my side to kind of change this industry is what we have found to be what gets us over that initial hump. I think to make it sustainable and everything else, you have to have a great business model. I'm not denying that. I'm a capitalist. I get it. But you have to have that emotional connection to take that risk and to believe that you're going to do something transformative, because this by definition is going to break. It's not going to be right. It's going to, if you want to poke holes in what we're about to talk about in terms of AI and say, here's all the reasons it doesn't work, that's an easy thing to do. It's how to find those gems inside of the overall system that is exciting. And they're fun people to work with, and every day is awesome, but it doesn't often fit neatly in an org chart.
Yeah, I think this segues nicely into our next area, which is something that you all have touched on already, and that's that big elephant in the room, the ROI. And I like to reference a a recent survey of several hundred senior healthcare executives, I think it was done by Optum, that found that about 6 in 10 of them said that they expect their organizations will see a full return on their AI investments in under 3 years. And I don't think that's super telling or fascinating, but what really is interesting is that only a couple of years ago, only 3 in 10 executives surveyed said that they expect to see a full ROI on their AI investments within 3 years. So clearly there is optimism. Folks are bullish, and they're more bullish than they ever were. Where does that land for you? Where do you fall on the scale of when do you expect, or when is it reasonable to expect AI investments to be fully realized and fully recognized? Garrett, why don't we start with you since?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, we try to evaluate what the potential timing could be on ROI before we partner with the companies. But ultimately, it's going to largely be based on the champion to realize that ROI, the business unit champion, the owner. So one of the core questions we ask ourselves is how difficult is this technology to integrate with our system and to implement? And so, we've been wrong before. I'll tell you straightforward, our review looking at this externally, we in some cases, we thought, this is a maximum 3-6 month implementation maximum. Believe it or not, some of these projects have taken, 3 to 4 times that length, which is quite frustrating for all of us involved that are championing these solutions. So the factors that influence the time to ROI are oftentimes outside of our immediate control or the company's control, and require a top-down orientation on change management, on really, kind of rewarding some of the behaviors that get people to move and adopt technologies. So again, it's a highly sensitive and important topic to always consider in bringing in technologies. Might be a different equation, when Michael's developing and Mark the technologies in-house. You may already have a greater degree of buy-in at that point to move projects forward. So I would love to hear their perspectives on this also.
So Garrett, as you well know, in some of our past ventures, we run into a rather unique problem in pediatrics where a lot of the vendors are focused on the adult population. And we try to take those tools and jam them into the pediatric space. And as you know, we have to do a lot of tweaking, a lot of changing of business model to achieve a result that's in alignment with what we face. And so that's a continual challenge in that we're roughly 20% of the market, and most of the tools and products today are focused on that other 80%, and rightfully so. When we took our first stab at readmission rate models, they were geared toward the adult population, and they gave us, less than desirable results. And so consequently, we had to work closely with the vendors to tighten that up so that it fit in our world. And it continues to be a challenge today.
Yeah, Mike, on the provider side as well, I'd love to hear your perspectives on this question.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple angles on this. I mean, so, Penn started the data science department, I guess 7 years ago. And, it took 2 years for them to get that return on investment from a, internal FTE cost. Technology, it was very small with open source technology. And since then, my department's kind of grown based on ROI. But I think, Garrett brought up a good point, Mark, as well, about just the time it takes to exhibit change in a health system. Remember, health systems are very lean by design. It's been kind of volume-based business models, and the focus has been driving down costs. You look at the pandemic and the shortage of nursing and physicians, that's, by design, that these are very lean systems. So whenever we have these kind of new projects coming through, change management and culture is really important, but just acknowledging there is no single person nurse, for example, that's in charge of like deploying new things. These are people that are putting in their extra time to kind of design and roll out these systems. And so typically something that's very impactful is something you're rolling out across the entity, and they take 6 to 18 months to get out and get done. And that's not 6 to 18 months of people working full time. That's kind of, you know, that's why we have like 15 different projects going on that we shelve some while, you know, our team is dealing with COVID and we work with you know, operation folks when we can. So just the reality of healthcare right now and how it's staffed and structured makes a slower adoption sometimes.
And I think a good follow-up or a good continuation to that, you know, this point is what do you, if AI and machine learning has kind of lived up to its promise in healthcare, and if it hasn't, of course, there are reasons and justifications for that. But you know, AI was really all the buzz for a few years at national trade shows, and you know, just when you speak to people, have conversations, they've been very bullish. But then you see on the ground that sometimes the reality and the work that's happening and the outcomes that are coming from that work aren't meeting the hype. It's a little bit of a, you know, in the clouds type of a question, but do you feel that, you know, AI and machine learning and, you know, everything that comes along with that has lived up to its promise so far?
Yeah. I'll jump on that one. That's something that I think about very often. You know, I think, you know, over the last 20 years, AI in healthcare has not lived up to its hype. But what I'm encouraged to see in just the last, you know, 2 to 3 years is the beginning of publications that are sophisticated in showing, you know, the checklist that you need to have to understand if these solutions are right for you. There's a AMIA publication in January talking about how do you deploy these things safely. There's, you know, ethical conversation. So there's this whole trend to looking at just the practicality of wielding this technology. And what we've seen is when you take these approaches that we've been talking about, kind of viewing these as evidence-based problems to solve and figuring out how to have that precision point of technology, as a rule of thumb, we see 10 to 20% improvement on whatever key performance indicator we're looking for. And so kind of back to the ROI piece, you know, we look at these clinical measures and then we look at operational measures and we kind of balance those two as a portfolio. And that's kind of the change in the realization of AI in healthcare, is this kind of change in culture of how to deploy and use technology in healthcare. And you'll start to see kind of these, not a different world the next day where, you know, there's technology coming out. You may have heard GPT, transform technology that can write romance editorials in the New York Times. We're not going to deploy that as a chatbot for a patient. You know, that thing doesn't know it's writing a romance novel. It's a specifically engineered system. And that's what all this AI is going to take, specifically engineered systems to deploy the right solutions. And that culture is beginning to happen in healthcare and take hold. And I think, you know, I'll say that started last year or just the year before. And we're going to start to see these like shifts coming through.
Yeah, and that culture change is not going to happen overnight, especially in this industry. Anybody else want to take a stab at that one? You know, how it's landed for you in terms of the promise and the hype versus what's going on in the trenches?
I could jump in and give an example because we're very sensitive to whether this is going to work or not. We probably have a more micro perspective, but I think that might be valuable. So I'll give one example of something that I think has been quietly transformative, which has been around stroke care. And one of the questions we always asked ourselves is, how does this fit into the flow of imaging information? And what we specialize in is moving imaging information from one location to the other. And what's really remarkable, we don't build these, we're just the railroad tracks for the algorithms that run on top, but there are a number of very exciting companies. Some have been actually granted reimbursement status by CMS to enable this kind of analysis for stroke care. And this kind of computer-aided analysis makes an immense difference about how you route people to centers of excellence for different types of interventions. And it's transformative, and it's really remarkable. These companies are prospering, and they're doing very well, and the institutions are adopting at different but relatively quick rates. So it doesn't feel like AI. It just feels like a better way to deliver stroke care. And I think the best AI doesn't feel like AI. It feels a little bit like a better way to do whatever you're going to do. So when I think about a Ring camera that analyzes stuff in my neighborhood, I don't think AI. I think this is a better way to do neighborhood security. And that's the goal of AI. And I think ultimately all of us will enjoy it without even kind of knowing it's there.
So you each have touched on a little bit some of the most promising use cases and breakthroughs. And I think when you have a discussion about AI, you kind of have to talk about what are the, what would have been the recent breakthroughs, what have been the, from a clinical standpoint, operational staffing, where have you, seen this technology to work? And I have a feeling you each are going to have different answers for this one. Ken, let's start with you. I know that Nuance is in the clinical documentation space. You've had a lot of success with different products there over the years. What's been trending in the last 6 months, 12 months, 2 years for where you really believe AI has broken through?
Yeah, I think what's, and this also I think somewhat relates back to the previous question on where do we see success in AI versus something that's overhyped. And I think I'll kind of connect the two in this question. I mean, I think the more precise you can define the problem that you're solving, and I think sort of the breakthrough that we've seen in the last couple of years is the way that we can get specific data on a very particular problem that we're looking to solve and have AI be trained on a very specific type of data set. That's where you can really solve these very specific problems. And so in the case of Nuance and our focus on documentation, I talk about data. I don't talk about data in the ether of anything coming in through an EHR system or across all different specialties. Looking at how you might be able to capture data in one specialty. You can take data in cardiology, and even in cardiology, look at data by chief complaint. And the way that you can teach the machine on very specific things to look for, given a conversation, a type of encounter, a chief complaint, their history that they might have, the way that the AI can be trained and adapted to look at something very specific. I think that's where, at least from our perspective at Nuance, our focus is on automating documentation. But I think the breakthrough of what we've seen, how AI can really apply in that goal, is the way that you're using the data most effectively, the way that you're slicing it, the way that you're looking at how to make the search space that the AI is working in, the more narrow you can make it in terms of what the AI is looking for. That's where you're just going to be driving up. In our case, in documentation, that's where you can really start to drive up levels of accuracy of what the AI is able to capture from the conversation. So really the access to that type of data and the way that you can fragment it and split it, and the way that you're training your AI on those different data sets, I would say from our perspective, that's been one of the bigger breakthroughs that we've seen.
Yeah, I want to hear from more of you on this question. And I want to shine a spotlight on Mark here. I hope that's okay, because I know that Mark and his team at Children's have done pretty specific work in response to the pandemic, which I think is really important. And you have seen that a lot of healthcare executives have accelerated their AI deployment plans in response to the crisis. So Mark, can you highlight some of the work that is being done at Children's specifically related to COVID?
Sure. As you know, once the pandemic set in, it really constrained the supply chains, and being able to get things like gloves and masks and reagents and all of that became very unpredictable. So it became very evident that we had to develop some models to help us understand how to manage the supplies that we did have. So in one particular case, we took 5 years worth of OR surgeries and analyzed all of the people who participated in those surgeries, and then modeled what PPE they would use as part of that case. And then we broke them down by regular procedures and aerosol generating procedures. So the outcome of this was to be able to still schedule OR cases, but be able to use that information to understand how it was going to affect our current inventories. And then we did some prediction on burn rates and things like that. And that really assisted the OR schedulers in knowing how much they could schedule and still safely keep a stock on hand. It's been 355 days now that that's been in place. And I think, quite frankly, pandemic or not, we'll continue to use that as an effective measure of efficiency going forward. The other thing that we did was with the COVID testing. You know, we could not always get COVID tests on a regular basis. So we had to apply, again, the same principles to manage that, so that we were testing effectively those patients who needed to be tested most. And so we created some models around that. And again, those are still in place. As COVID hopefully dwindles, there will be less of a need for it, but the concept will carry into other areas. The last one we did was, we were concerned, as everybody rightfully was, that the flu season would collide with COVID, and we were going to have some real challenges with staffing, with beds, all that kind of thing. Well, we developed models to kind of predict how we would handle that based on past year's flu. And the good news is, here we are approaching the end of February, and we've had 4 flu cases for the entire season. It's really a historic occurrence. And that it's never happened before. So obviously social distancing and masks and all that play into that, but 4 cases is just absolutely remarkable. Didn't decrease the need for the work to be done, but again, those principles and concepts carry forward into other areas, both clinically and operationally at Children's.
Yeah, I want to hear Penn's perspective too, Mike, in terms of what what has been trending in terms of the use cases that you feel really bullish and you're really excited about.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I just really resonate with both those points. Focusing on the specific problems and the targeted data set to those problems, and COVID definitely significantly impacted the way we do business. So, one thing, so we started out with the typical, data science problems to solve, detect early, risk of sepsis, mortality, readmission, like all those things, like detect these things because we want to stop these things. And we saw, a lot of clinical uptake, people happy with this, but we didn't see significant change in patients' lives. They wouldn't know, we didn't see a drop in deaths. We didn't see a drop in, people falling into severe sepsis. We didn't see a drop in readmissions, frankly. But what we began to do was figure out what are the types of problems, the categories of problems that we need to solve. And there's kind of this, I didn't know this thing is going to happen. So kind of this data, this gap of knowledge, to I know something bad is happening, what is it? So kind of entering that hypothesis testing for the clinician. But the area that we found the most uptake in is communication between teams, the lack of communication between teams. So you might have a resident, a fellow providing for a patient that suspects sepsis. That suspicion of sepsis often isn't carried into the next shift, isn't carried into the ED or home care. The big win that we've been seeing over and over and over again is using natural language understanding, natural language processing to basically bring in all that information to basically have like a pseudo button that's being pushed by the clinician saying, this person is suspected of having sepsis. This person is suspected of having stroke. This person is suspected of having, cardiac arrest. We have like 5 or 6 projects like this where we're really just using these modern open source transform libraries to train on all these clinical notes and just repeating this use case where we're providing this insight and then working with the clinical team to reimagine how these teams work together and providing those insights. And there's all kinds of values that CFOs recognize, the clinical team recognizes, and the quality folks that report those externally recognize. And that's been our big win in the last 2 or 3 years. So it's connected to kind of the advancements in AI through these transforms and kind of the point of connecting into these decision makers. One piece on the COVID side, the big win in deploying these systems is this modern approach of DevOps. I won't go into that term, but if you're taking notes, look that up. It's a process of delivering software, connecting development to operations, containerization, like easy ways to contain this technology, and of course, open source. And when COVID happened, we also created a model to kind of track the forecast of inpatients that would be coming in with COVID. And we basically open sourced that and deployed it, and it was used around the world for folks that didn't have internal teams like Mark and I to do that. And that really was an eye opener for us, where our small team of 8 people could deploy an application used worldwide. So from that point, we pivoted strongly to get everything out in Azure and to really commit to DevOps and continuous integration and continuous deployment. And that's really transformed the way our team has done business just in this past year. And that, I really credit, COVID, silver lining of figuring out, what do we need to do to service these immediate needs.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that's great. Morris, we know that medical imaging is clearly one area where AI is widely used, perhaps more so than other aspects of the healthcare ecosystem. In theory, AI will help radiologists improve their diagnostics and their workflow processes. What have been some of the really recent breakthroughs that you believe are happening in the world of AI and medical imaging recently?
Absolutely. It actually is interesting. I'd like to build on what Mark and Mike just said, because in a weird way, I think they have encapsulated how you want to think about medical imaging too, and the breakthroughs that are there, which is, I don't know if you noticed, but the way Mark talked about it, he talked like a data scientist. He talked about training sets and validation sets. He didn't use those words maybe, but everybody who's looking at data right now has to understand how you're thinking about data sets to train on and then to be able to validate. And medical imaging is no different. When you think about how you're going to operate, you're no longer thinking about a kind of old world PACS environment. You're thinking about building these dynamic data sets. And what makes that possible is what Mike said. Mike really sort of said, you need to be in the cloud to do this, because it's very, very difficult to be able to get the collaborative benefit of the new data without that. And one of the things that I think is true in medical imaging too, is that's a transformation for them. I think if you think about it's a little bit of a parody, but if you think about the radiologist in the dark room looking at a bunch of monitors spitting out a report, that is no longer the model that is the optimal way for people to get care. And interestingly, we see this more than anywhere in pediatrics, because thank God, pediatric cases, we always hope this, are rare. So to see enough data to start making a difference, you have to collaborate across many institutions and build these rare disease networks. So what's really changed is, I love hearing the data scientists on, and I think that my other prediction is that this is not based on training and validation set, but my prediction is that every healthcare system is going to start being dominated by senior executives who have data science experience, in the same way that you saw that in the financial services sector. You simply won't have a senior leadership team that isn't infused with that way of thinking. And that's happening in medical imaging too.
And I would add on to that, to what Mike said a little bit earlier. In addition to data science, the role of the informaticist is greatly improved because of the clinical interpretation. And all of that feeds into improved workflows, which should improve outcomes. And it really gets down to that, those two teams coming together.
I couldn't agree more. I think that you are, all you need to look at it is the composition of JP Morgan's leadership team. And if you think Jamie Dimon isn't focused on data scientists, and technologists, informaticists, that's who's driving progress at these big financial institutions. And I think that's happening in healthcare very rapidly, and particularly in medical imaging, which has always been a little bit of a ground zero for innovators because the tech is so cool.
And it's a really fascinating point and sort of debate, if you will, about whether organizations should be bringing in data scientists into healthcare from other industries, as you mentioned, Morris, or conversely, should they be training data science or people in healthcare to become data scientists? You're a data scientist, Mike. What do you think about that? Is one approach favored over the other, or can it work both ways?
Yeah, both ways. I mean, I'm from missile defense. I've been in healthcare for 7 years. I still feel like a newbie in terms of, delivering clinical care. My team's made up of people coming from the marketing industry to, ecology. But we are also training internally from bioinformaticists. We have these unicorns that you find, these physicians that gravitate to clinical informatics, start to sling code. And so it comes both ways to have a healthy career development path for internal data scientists. But, to Morris's point there, 100% we need leaders that, understand how to think this way, not necessarily how to code an AI algorithm, but understand how to use statistics, data, design to really drive towards improvement and give direction to these data scientists and informaticists.
It's interesting when you're talking about AI, the words mistakes and failures seem to come up perhaps more than in other areas of healthcare conversations, and more than they should. Mistake is kind of a loaded word, but it's kind of part of failing fast, right? And if so where are the mistakes and the failures happening most, and how can we get better in those specific areas going forward?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that quickly. I mean, so I'm trying to change the language a little bit, a lot actually. So within our process, we just have an engineering process where, you have a problem, you don't know what the solution is, and you're going to work to get there. So we have these milestones and off ramps. Feasibility, can we solve this problem? An impact assessment, is your hypothesis realized to success? And then you move to scale. And it's a way to kind of manage that pipeline of improvement, without talking about, wow, we did this full scale deployment and it failed. It's a way to kind of manage change within the health system. And that's from a lot of failure. That's from doing full system deployments and realizing, oh, things didn't change. And kind of the way we've approached that.
I want to get to a wrap-up question in a minute, but we do have a few questions from the audience, and because they've been so great and hanging with us for an hour, I do want to get to a few of them. One is about, sorry, I'm going to pull it up right here. Rural health, quite a fascinating area of healthcare. How do you think rural health will be able to inherit AI and data-driven healthcare, and what are the barriers that need to be addressed before this happens within the rural health context? And I want to take a stab at that one.
Mm-hmm. Well,
I do. Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I cut you off.
Go ahead. Okay. Well, real quick, I think, we have to, and Penn and other health systems have to be leaders in showing that you're not going to lose your shirt by having an internal data science team, that it is better for the bottom line to have a team and an approach to understand how to use these systems. But whether or not you have a data science team, you still need a structure and culture around innovation to apply, if it's a vendor solution, apply that vendor solution. The process doesn't change. Whether or not you have a data science team or you have a vendor coming in, you still need that culture and process to approach that. And so our job as leaders here is to demonstrate how that's better for the health system and better for the population that the health system cares for.
And I was just going to follow up on that, on something actually Mike was alluding to earlier, which is, it is mind-blowing what anybody can do right now with you need some internet connection, But once you have that, what is available in the cloud and what you can run is unbelievable. And so what I encourage is for you to reach out to leaders who are super generous. One thing I love about the AI community, because all of us feel a little bit like we're out on a ledge, maybe, people are pretty generous and they talk to each other. And if you want to run one of these algorithms inside of an Azure or Google or AWS cloud environment, it is doable, and it could really help your population in a way that they'll think they can't even believe you've brought Star Trek to their small community, which might not otherwise have the ability to buy some of the really giant machines or some of these other things, but the algorithms can be distributed.
I will say that first point you brought up about internet and broadband, especially in rural health, might not be as much of a given as some might think, but you're
That's
right.
True.
Stephen, I know that there's been a few questions coming directly to the chat, so do you want to go over a few of those?
Yeah, absolutely. So Brenda, your last name is, hang on just a second, let me pull it up here. Brenda Siren, you had raised your hand to ask a question live. If you still want to ask that question, hit the hand raise button again and we'll open up your mic. And then there was actually one question that one of our panelists had answered in the attendee chat, and I wanted to ask it and see if there's any other panelists that wanted to weigh in. The question was, you mentioned productivity for ROI and new revenue. Does the CFO see clinician time productivity and thus capacity is relevant to them? And I know, Mike, you answered that question in the chat, but Mark, Garrett, Morris, Ken, any response to that?
With the past year that we've had, expense management has been absolutely critical because we've lost revenue and there's no two ways around that. And one of the ways we do that is by measuring productivity at a very granular level, whether it be an acute care services unit or an ICU unit. It's imperative that we are staffed completely to our census and not in traditional fashion when people just tended to show up. So I think it's imperative going forward that we maintain these practices as we turn to some semblance of normalcy, because it's a success factor. It's that simple.
Great. So Brenda didn't raise her hand again, but Aaron Schneider did. So Aaron, make sure your microphone is unmuted and I'm going to let you ask your question live. Hang on just a second, Aaron. See if this works. This is the first time we're using this, so I'm very excited. Hang on. Aaron, can you hear us?
Yeah, hi everyone.
Welcome, Aaron. Go ahead and ask your question.
So I wanted to ask Mr. Morris, how can AI be integrated with DICOM functionality, and what are the possible perspectives?
So, great topic. What's very nice about this is using cloud, you can, with appropriate safeguards, you have to be very careful with patient information, but it is now a very normal process to de-identify data so that you're not compromising PHI and you're operating in a HIPAA compliant way. Take that into a cloud bucket, and you are then able to run algorithms. And believe it or not, you could actually find some of these things on Kaggle and just run it yourself and see I wouldn't use that on a patient, but you'll see the miraculous power of this. It'll get you excited. It's super fun to tinker with it. And it will give a kind of good proof point to the organization when you find that unicorn, who are becoming more and more common, an informaticist or radiology informaticist, they will love you for this. And I suspect that both Mike and Mark have a lot of these guys and gals running around their institutions chomping at the bit to do more of this.
Yep.
Thank you, Morris. Thank you, Aaron. Aaron, I'm going to go ahead and mute your microphone.
Thank you so much.
All right. Let's see. Thank you, Aaron. That was awesome. You were the first person to do a live question, so we really appreciate it. All right. Tamar, I saw that your question that you put into the chat. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I will forward that question to the panelists and ask them if they can respond to that via email. And Rajiv, why don't you go ahead? You had one last question that we wanted to do before we closed.
Sure, yeah, and this will have to be quick because we're up against it, but I have confidence in you all providing a brief answer. All right, I'll put you all on the spot quickly. One prediction or thought of the future of where AI and healthcare and any different aspects will continue to grow and evolve in the near term, the next 12 months? One quick area. Morris, let's start with you.
You're going to see more and more distributed healthcare delivery models enabled by AI. We're going to be doing more and more out of the hospital and in the home.
Yeah, awesome. I think we're seeing a lot of that. Mike, how about you?
Yeah, well, I'll pile on that and say I think that's true. And what we'll start to see more and more is chatbot technology to kind of reduce the friction for patient access and expand the reach of the clinical teams.
Garrett, how about you?
Yeah, I already had that thought also. So adding to the pile on chatbots to triage patients prior to coming into the system as a way to, increase efficiency.
All right, Ken?
Yeah, I think you're going to see a lot of more real-time systems that can actually engage the clinician while they're interacting with the patient, to serve up guidance, suggestions, evidence-based, recommendations for care pathways, so that real-time care intelligence, while a physician is actually engaging a patient. I think there's going to be 1,000 of these different services that show up in the next few years.
And Mark?
Well, I certainly agree with all of that, but I also think that what you're going to see continue to grow is the integration of the community-based organizations with the healthcare providers to make sure that we have an effective, not only an effective referral base, but a feedback loop to let the healthcare providers know that referrals were taken advantage of. And then overall, that will improve social determinants of health. And we'll learn a lot more with that. And we'll use AI, again, to analyze that to a successful outcome.
The convergence of AI and SDOH is fascinating. We couldn't have, we needed more time to get to that one. We probably could do a whole other discussion on that. Thank you so much. It was a great, diverse panel discussion. You all provided such expert insight. I learned a lot. I had a great time. Thank you, everybody, to our audience for joining us. Stephen, I'll kick it quickly back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rajiv. And yes, thank you again, panelists. Thank you as well to Ambra and Nuance for supporting this session. As a quick reminder, everyone, the next session kicks off at 12 Eastern, and it's all about payer-provider relationships and data exchange. It's going to be a great one. We have a wonderful group of panelists, just like this group of panelists that we have this morning. And don't forget, the sessions will be available on demand. And panelists, when I hang up, I'm going to disconnect from you all too. We don't have an outgoing green room like we had in the beginning. So thank you all so much. I'll send you all an email with the link to the session. And for those attendees, you guys can watch that session via the event page on demand. So, all right. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful morning, and we'll see you guys at 12 Eastern for the next session. Bye-bye.
Thank you.